Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kiran Pasricha, and I'm with the Ananta Aspen Center. A very warm welcome to everyone in the audience. It is an absolute pleasure and honor to welcome our esteemed speakers for this very special virtual session on Portraits of Power, half a century of being at Ringside by the star of the evening, Mr. NKSingh. Mr. NKSingh is an eternal optimist about India and believes in only finding solutions to the problems. His book takes us through his journey of over half a century of public policy making in India. Few people know more about India's systems than Mr. Singh. Even fewer have the authority that he commands, having been at the helm of several positions in the central government, in Bihar, in Parliament, and in his current role as the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission of India. Portraits of Power is not just an autobiography of a man who for several decades has played an active role in India's march towards becoming a formidable economy. It is indeed, on multiple levels, a book that profiles several institutions that work in harmony to make things happen. And in everything that Mr. NKSingh has done, so in this book too, there is both incisive clarity and insightful anecdotal heft. Welcome, sir. And thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to host this session for you.
Thank you.
Joining Mr. Singh, our very special guest, Mr. Sinha, currently chairperson of the Parliamentary Standing Committee for Finance, and the BJP Lok Sabha MP from Hazaribagh, Jharkhand. As an MP, Mr. Sinha has ushered in notable innovations, including a district-wide scorecard-based monitoring system, centralized midday meals for primary schools, and humane land acquisition policies. He has also served on India's Council of Ministers from 2014 to 2019, first as the Minister of State for Finance, and then as the Minister of State for Civil Aviation. Welcome, Mr. Sinha. Dr. Arvind Panagaria is a professor of economics in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, New York. Between January 2015 and August 2017, he served as the vice chairman of the Government of India's think tank, Niti Aayog. In the past, he has been the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank and has worked for the World Bank, IMF, and UNCTAD. In 2012, he was awarded the prestigious Padma Bhushan. Welcome, Dr. Panagaria.
Thank you.
Mr. Uday Kotak is the founder and MD and CEO of Kotak Mahindra Bank and the current president of the Confederation of Indian Industry. He has previously served as chairman of the SEBI-constituted Corporate Governance Committee. In October 2018, Government of India appointed Mr. Kotak as the non-executive chairman of the new ILF and FS board, with a mandate to steer one of India's largest NBFCs out of the crisis that it is caught up in. Welcome, Mr. Kotak.
Hi.
And finally, I would like to welcome our moderator for the evening, Mr. Tarun Das. Mr. Das is currently the chairman of the Institute of Economic Growth, Sasakawa India Leprosy Foundation, and the chairman of the advisory board of JCB India. He is on the board of trustees of various nonprofit institutions, including the Ananta Aspen Center and Ananta Center. Thank you, Mr. Das, for agreeing to moderate this conversation, which we are all looking forward to. May I now hand over the proceedings to you to take forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you for that outstanding introduction to all our four outstanding speakers, including our author, Mr. NKSingh. NK and I go back 3 decades or more through many incarnations and reincarnations. And I have one difference with him about the title of the book. He says, he talks of the ringside. I actually think that Mr. NKSingh was inside the ring. He was not on the ringside, very much in the ring as part of one of the contestants or participants or one of the boxers, as it were. And that's why he is able to give us such a fantastic view of what happened over the last 50 plus years. NK, I want to start with you before I turn to the panel. And I'm going to turn to the panel in the reverse order of Kiran's introductions. I'm going to start with Uday and work backwards. But NK, everybody knows all your public positions. And Kiran has listed some of them, not all. But who is NK Singh? Who's the private person? What does NK Singh do uh, in his off time from work? What does he like? What does he not like? Tell us a little, let the audience an insight into Mr. NK Singh. NK, over to you.
Well, thank you, Tarun. First and foremost, I'm privileged and grateful that the Ananta Aspen Center considered it possible for them to host this evening's very special event. And to be able to do so, being able to get together people with whom I have worked earlier, with you, Tarun, as you mentioned, Uday, which he remembers from the stage when he was just about beginning to set up his own banking venture, wondering on the role of private banks, to Arvind, whom I have known for God knows how many years, primarily as an academic, and thereafter in some public positions which we held where we really interacted very closely. To Jayant, of course, with whom my relationship is of two generations, to say the least. And I have seen Jayant just about growing up and achieving all the academic attainments. And he has done not only his parents, but done close family friends like me and to many of his other family friends. Jayant, you have done us proud by what you have already achieved, and with sky is the limit. And thank you, of course, Tarun, for wanting to moderate this and asking that first initial question. What do I do in private life? Well, four or five things which come to my mind. What do I do in private? First of all, my passion for Indian classical music. That from the morning till late night keeps me deeply engrossed. I would, for instance, invariably begin my morning by an Asavari Tori, of done very well by Bhimsen Joshi for me at my house. And I would end the evening by perhaps a Kishori Amonka's recital, singing Rag Bihag, which she was generous enough to sing it around my name because she utters the name, my full name, Nand Kishore, several times, and the rag was composed, she said, primarily aimed at me. Jai Jai Rag, she did this in Rag, Jai Jai Vanti. I in the midday would listen to Pandit Jasraj on some of his my more favorite pieces with him, and in the early part of the afternoon, Bihag. Then, of course, I have this great passion, which Tarun, you know, I don't know if Arvind knows, with homeopathic medicine. I acquired this from my maternal grandfather who lived up to 92, never took an allopathic medicine. He was a great believer in homeopathy. He presented me a whole library of homeopathic medicines. So not only I practice to my friends like you, Tarun, inflict some homeopathic medicines, but I certainly take them myself. That's another passion. My third passion, if I may say, is photography, horticulture, and gardening. The book which I want to publish, which is all ready, is the book entitled Roses in the Tropics, which are photographs of rose plants grown in my own garden in my ancestral home in Patna. And that, I think, is the other area. And then, of course, is gardening and horticulture. I've often joked, and Arvind may not know this, that when I told my parents that who knows, I may or may not get into the service which I wanted, which is in the book. I wanted the foreign service. Who knows if I do not get in? They asked me what. I said, still there may be a vacant post of a gardener in Patna. And I could spend a good amount of time kindling this strong passion. So that's enough for keeping me engaged, Tarun. And thank you for this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving us that insight. And those of us who have been to your various offices over the last few decades the music plays in the office, right? The music is always playing in your
That,
office in the
that's
background. And I remember that distinctly. I'm going to turn to an extraordinary banker. I'm an extraordinary banker, a charismatic CII president, a man of courage in setting up a bank after, took the risk and put his foot into the water. Um, Done amazing well. He is one person who has earned earned and kept the trust of government, and that is reflected in the responsibility given to him with ILFS. It's a huge, huge responsibility, which he is quietly performing and never speaks about it, uh, sorting out all the different hurdles and different issues. But my question to you there, have we missed out on banking reforms? Because NK's book talks about reforms. We started in 1991. We've gone down the way on many things. There was a very fine period between 91 96. And as Mr. Sinha and I were talking earlier, there was a great period between 99 and 2004. What happened to banking reforms? Have we missed the bus on that? Over to you.
Tarun, thank you. And you ask very difficult question. So it goes back to bank nationalization days, 1969.
Yeah.
I believe that bank nationalization happened because of politics, not necessarily economics alone. Yes, there was a need for broadening financial inclusion, for spreading banking to the length and breadth of the country. I genuinely believe we could have achieved that through a law and a legal process. But the fact of the matter is, more than 50 years ago, India took a decision at that point of time in history, which is 1969. Having said that, in India, once a political decision or an economic decision is taken, it is a mammoth task to reverse it. And we are seeing it in a number of areas and across governments, including governments with big majorities. And some of those challenges which we are seeing play out even today. So once we got into the specter of nationalized banking, we then have struggled to get out of it, and inevitably the politics of populism and is a big issue when we want to bring about change. And if you look at the returns on capital invested by the government and the taxpayer from the fisc over the last 50 odd years, it's a very significant amount. But how do we get out of this? My view is we will have to get out of this in a very systematic, slow, considered, well-organized manner. And we cannot do it with one sweep of a pen overnight. My suggestion would be to start with, consider a few banks and not the larger banks, where you expand the capital base of these banks through raising of new capital in the public markets, whereby the resultant ownership goes below 50%. The second way could be set up a bank holding company as step one, but ultimately what is needed is broad basing of ownership and management from the current challenges. Banking has become an extremely competitive, consumer-oriented and a customer-oriented business. It requires a completely different mindset when we are seeing the future competing with the Googles, the Facebooks, the Apples, and the Amazons of the world in the financial services arena. And to NK's point about ringside view, I think the time has come for India now to jump into the ring and have a financial sector reform like never before. And on a lighter note, Tarun, I must share something with all of you. I have the passion for Indian classical music as much. In a different way, I used to play the sitar as an instrument for many, many years before I lost the string of the sitar to the day-to-day chores of finance. And I miss it a lot. And NK, Jai Jaiwanti is one of my favorite ragas as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you Uday, for a very, very clear response. I'm going to turn to Professor Panagria, outstanding economist, wonderful human being, liked and respected worldwide. Um, Professor, your writings reflect your views, and your views show us a direction towards an open economy, a competitive economy, a globalized economy for India. So when you look at what has been happening here, and you have written about it, that we are having increases in tariffs, we are more or less going away from the globalization thing. And of course, that's become a universal thing now, whether it's USA or elsewhere. It's not only India. Do you think that is industry holding back? You've been vice chairman of Niti Aayog for several years. Is it industry holding back the further opening of the economy? Is it that industry which in the 90s actually came out of protection and became globally competitive? It is that industry which has got outstanding entrepreneurs in the country and who are have been investing abroad, including in the USA where you reside. So what is your assessment of this situation? Is it government acting on its own, or is it industry holding government back? Another tough question.
No, very fair question. Very fair question. No, I laughed because everybody is for protection. I'm just a one-man army fighting against it. In India, yes, the government, of course, agrees with giving protection to the domestic industry, but the industry, of course, also loves it. So we have Uday here, but with apologies to him, CII is not a champion of free trade either. Now I can understand individual industries asking for protection because whoever gets protection experiences a rise in profitability. What happens is that the cost is diffused into other sectors. And that cost adds up to a lot more than the benefit to the particular sector that gets protected. So that is the problem. So each industry wanting protection for itself is a good thing, or is sort of understandable why they would ask for it. But at least the industry associations you would expect would be champions of freer trade in general. Or at least of the agreements that will bring access to the markets for them as a whole. But which means that if we are negotiating free trade agreements, or even if we are not, the industry associations would push for such negotiations so that at least they also get markets of the partner countries opened up while we open up our own. But you don't see that in India. And it is a strange phenomenon because, I sort of understands it. When 1991, we saw a lot of the opposition by the industry, and the industry said, well, let's first open domestically, meaning and the investment licensing, but let's keep protection against foreign trade. I mean, one could understand it in those days. But now we have seen the results come out. If you look at 2003 to 2011, merchandise exports alone went up from $50 billion to $300 billion. There's a six-fold increase in 9 years. Nothing, you haven't seen that in anything else. And yet, we sort of want protection to rise, not fall. So that's a pity, but we have to, keep the good fight on. And that's one thing, the government has done lots of very good things from the IBC to the reduction in the corporate profit tax to GST to labor laws, which for 30 years we were struggling on, and the government has done that. So a lot of good things have happened. But I feel that, to go from 8 to 10%, one is going to need open markets, globalized markets. So that has been one of the pitches I've made for the current budget, that, we should reverse the process. Our average tariffs, which used to be about 12%, this is for industrial products, like excluding agriculture. They used to be 12%, I've now gone up to 14. And I think we have to come back to at least 10. I mean, my ideal would be 7, 8%, but at least come back to 10. I think we need to do that. Without that, we cannot get that extra 2 percentage points. In the end, there is not an economy which has grown at 8 to 10% without open markets, without conquering the world markets. And you cannot do that without being open.
But how do you deal with China, Professor? Because they don't follow any of the international trading rules.
Right.
How do you compete with China?
Well, I think the way to compete is to continue to do various reforms. You see, one of the dangers of protection, and also I should say, subsidies like PLI that we have now been doing, is that we substitute those for the genuine reforms. Industry often comes in and says, oh, I got 15% disability or something. So then the government says that I'll correct that disability by giving you more protection or giving you a subsidy. That's not how we should do it, because when you reduce the disability of one industry, you create the disability for another. In the end, capital is limited, and if capital is going to move into protected sectors, the unprotected sectors are going to bear the brunt of it. So what we need to do is we need to continue to reform. As far as China is concerned, look, it is a large country, no doubt, but there is the global market. Global market is $25 trillion, just the export market between merchandise and services. What are we doing with respect to Europe? What are we doing with respect to UK? What are we doing with respect to Australia? I mean, whole of Asia, other than China. We ought to at least, penetrate those markets if we cannot penetrate the Chinese market. I mean, even for geopolitical reasons, I have backed off myself. I was a big champion of the RCEP. But after Galwan Valley incident, I have backed off and said, yes, we can't trust China because ultimately it's the Communist Party CCP, which is going to call the shots. And we have seen that happen to Australia, who is actually a part of the RCEP, but that has not deterred Chinese from taking protective actions against Australia. So it cannot be trusted anymore after Galwan Valley. But then we have to go with the other countries. We have not done that still. European Union, I think we ought to have a clear policy to open up through some sort of free trade agreement. That's it. We have no issues on agriculture there because Europe is not super competitive in agriculture. In fact, our agriculture will very much benefit from getting access to the European market. But our textiles and clothing industry, a lot of the light manufacturers, that's where, but we've got to be also willing to open our own markets. I mean, what is the problem? Their two industries are auto and spirits, alcohol. And I think, we ought to be willing to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. Mr. Jayant Sinha, outstanding professional. I can't say strayed into politics. I suppose deliberately stepped into politics. Minister of State for Finance, Minister of State for Civil Aviation. So deep understanding and exposure to the economy, exposure to the infrastructure sector. When you look at the economic strategy going forward, and now chairman of the Standing Committee of Parliament, what do you see, Mr. Sinha, as 2 or 3 of the key strategic issues to get our economy to a better place? We've recovered from COVID, industry has come back, things are looking good. I get good feedback from many companies now, which is a great story actually for India, unlike many other countries. So 2021 onwards, where do we go? What are your thoughts? 1, 2, 3 quick points.
I think three very important priorities which have been reflected in the Atmanirbhar policy package. The first is to really enable private sector investment, because if we want to get onto the fast growth trajectory that Professor Panagaria was speaking about, the 8 to 10% fast growth trajectory, we need to have much more private sector investment. That also leads to sustainable growth, it leads to jobs, and it's very important for the economy that that impetus comes from private sector investment. Government is already doing what it can as far as public sector investment is concerned. So that's the first priority. The second priority, of course, is in social and health spending. Obviously, what the COVID pandemic has shown us is that we need to step up the resources we are putting into public health. We need to step up the resources that we have going into agriculture. We have to step up the resources going into education and nutrition. So spending, for the vulnerable sections of population, particularly in the social sector, is a second very important priority. The third important priority is, in fact, exports. And if you look at all the steps that have been taken to make the economy more competitive, whether it is in the mining industry, whether it is in labor reforms, in agriculture, or very importantly in production-linked incentives, all of these are intended to drive exports and to ensure that India becomes an even stronger and more capable exporting nation, because ultimately, as Professor Panagare has correctly pointed out, that you can't sustain growth over a long period of time unless you are one of the world's top exporters. So I would say those are the three important priorities that you can see coming through in the various different proposals that have been laid out. Number one, of course, being in private sector investment, second, social sector, and third, exports.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for being so brief and crisp. Uday, private sector investment. Mr. Sinha spoke about this. Private sector is central to growth and to development. Mr. Panagria referred to industry wanting protection, some question marks about CII, but we may go there. Is the private sector ready to lead? Is the private sector ready to lead, take responsibility, move things ahead? Prime Minister repeatedly asks for more and more domestic investment. He is seeking constantly foreign investment. There seems to be a concern that domestic investment is not coming through. So will you help us to understand what is going on in the minds of the Indian private sector?
I think I need to answer in two parts.
Yeah.
First, to my good friend Arvind Panagaria on behalf of CII. Let me first assure you that CII is fully supportive of a competitive and a globally engaged India while fully embracing Atmanirbhar Bharat. I genuinely believe Atmanirbhar Bharat, in terms of how the government is looking at it, is consistent with a competitive and a globally engaged India. The two are not different. And in fact, I'm glad to hear my friend Jayant Sinha also talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat as the spirit of India, a self-reliant India, a confident India, but an India which is ready to be engaged with the rest of the world on a competitive basis. So that's the way I see India's approach to trade, not from a point of weakness, of protectionism, but from a point of batting on the front foot and making Indian industry more competitive and therefore self-reliant and self-confident. So Arvind, I would just want to tell you that Indian industry is fully confident, and I would like to believe in my role as CII that we at Indian industry are fully out there to make Prime Minister's dream of Atmanirbhar Bharat take it forward. On the point of private investment, I think the pandemic has had led to a shock in terms of demand in the initial stages. So capacity utilizations of Indian business went down. It has now come back. And interestingly, there are some supply side bottlenecks, but as capacity utilization goes up, the current levels are probably still around 65 to 70%. As we go to levels of 75 to 80%, I think there will be a sense of private investment being bold enough to come in. And to be frank, right now, the pricing power has been significant in many parts of Indian industry. So there is been pretty decent profitability, and that helps private sector to have animal spirits come back. I would also like to here point out that both the government and RBI have done a lot to ensure that we have a high liquidity, low interest rate regime. It is extremely crucial that as we get out of the pandemic, business and industry also gets a stable tax and an interest rate regime as capacity utilization goes up and animal spirits come back. The last thing we want at this stage is significant changes in tax policy and interest rates, especially in 2021 and 22.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll come back to you, Professor, in a minute, but I want to ask Mr. Jayant Sinha a question related to what Uday said about private sector's willingness to lead and to move ahead. There's been a lot of emphasis on ease of doing business, Mr. Sinha. And that has been because over decades, we have kind of clogged ourselves with all kinds of procedures, regulations, controls, all of which kind of put handcuffs on the economic system, on industry. Do you see that there is more trust within the government, within the political leadership towards the industry, where you can dismantle large amounts of these regulations and trust industry so that you give them more freedom, give more free space to the entrepreneurship that we really have an abundance of in India?
Tarun, that is absolutely what the Honorable Prime Minister wants. Let me give you some examples. GST is an extraordinary simplification of the indirect tax structure. We got rid of some 39 different excise frameworks and obviously different state laws to come up with an integrated GST framework. Similarly, if you look at the 4 labor codes, they have also consolidated many different archaic rules and regulations into 4 streamlined labor codes. We've done the same thing by abolishing from the statute books many antiquated and obsolete laws. So wherever we can find procedural simplifications, whenever we can digitize things, move things online, we have been consistently doing that. And in fact, now the real challenge is less so at the center and much more in the states, where in many states, the procedural simplification and the bureaucratic responsiveness is still quite low. I'll tell you, for example, in Jharkhand, my own home state, if you look at land records still, even though they've been digitized, have not been streamlined or clarified. And that's a real impediment for investment and real estate and everything else. That's just one example I'm giving you of the challenges that we face in various states. So a lot of help is required now from the private sector, from industry, to tell us where these bottlenecks are in terms of processes and procedures and red tape. And then we can get at them and really try and simplify and consolidate them like we've done at the central level. And of course, this becomes a race to the top, if you will. The more states simplify and get easier from a business perspective, the more investment they acquire. And obviously that really creates pressure on all the other states to do better as well. And I think that's really been demonstrated. The states that have attracted more investment and more jobs, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and so on, have shown that they have been good at doing this. And really we need to continue to encourage it. But at the central level, I think we've got an excellent track record of consolidation, simplification, and so on. I'll conclude with a final example of DGCA, which is the Directorate General of Civil Aviation. There was a time when I came to the ministry when all the interactions with the ministry, renewal of pilot licenses, basically taking an airplane through the repair shop, everything was on paper. Now we've pretty much moved everything to an online platform, and that has made a huge difference for the airlines. So these are just examples that I'm quoting of how we have worked in the central government.
I'm going to come to Mr. NKSingh in a minute, but Professor, when you listen to Uday, when you listen to Mr. Sinha, how do you feel? How do you feel about the coming year? How do you feel about the near to medium term future about India?
Okay. So to Uday first, I hope the CII next time makes a representation to the government of India to and gives it a roadmap to bring down the tariffs from 14% average to 10%. Then I would see that you are putting your money where your mouth is. As far as the self-reliant India is concerned, I am all with it actually, and I've never connected. I think repeatedly when people try to connect the protectionism that has risen up in India to Atmanirbhar Bharat, I always rail against it, because that's not the context in which Prime Minister spoke of self-reliant India. He spoke in a very different context to the entire country. This was, first time he spoke was in an address to the nation, and that was to the entire India, and self-reliance is very different from protectionism that we have actually gotten into. And that predated, from 2018, we had started raising the tariffs. So that's very quick. Now, turning to how I see post-COVID decades, I think are going to be fantastically great decades, because large number of reforms, which I have been myself writing for almost 20 years, have not been done, except this issue of openness. Banks, I think, banks is also a big issue, because credit has to expand. Without credit, there is no game. And that means banking reforms. And to me, one of the simplest places to start is to take the bottom 6 banks from the public sector. They account for only 15% of the public sector assets in banking. Just take them out and privatize them. Also give entry to the. I've not written yet, but very soon I will. I think we ought to allow corporates, even non-financial corporates, into the banking sector. It's a long case to be made, but I'll just put that on the table. I think we need to bring investment into banking, and credit has to be provided. So that's so these are some of the few things still to be done. But I think 80% of the reforms have been done, and I just want to echo Mr. Sinha here that I think states can do a lot. Even on labor, for example, one thing left is the hire and fire policy, which is now, flexibility is given only to firms with 300 workers. But the legislation empowers the states to do it just by notification, raise that limit to 10,000. And this is where also then there are land related issues which need to be done against state level reforms. I would really urge that, that pick up 2 or 3 BJP states and get them to really do it full steam. Because in the end, businesses don't have to locate themselves in all 29 states or 28 states. If we can get 3 or 4 states going, I think, look, China, you got basically a few provinces on the coast, and they really carried almost the entire China. And that's what we ought to be able to do. So I think post-COVID decades are going to be 8 to 10%, depending on, 8 if we don't do a lot more on reforms, and 10 I think if we do a few more reforms.
Thank you. NK, you've been listening to these 3 outstanding panelists giving their different perceptions and different views. Love to hear you, and because you have such a rich experience and rich knowledge.
Well, I don't disagree with most of what has been said, but I'd just like to anecdotally mention a few. Tarun, you began by asking Uday the question of whether we missed the great moment in 1991 on opening up of the banking and financial sector. Answer is yes, we did. We did, Uday, because the negotiators, of which I was privileged to be an integral component, managed to get off the 91 crisis without too much of a haircut. And one of the quarterly performance criteria, which we had agreed on for access to the resources of the International Monetary Fund, one of the issues which we bypassed by setting up 2 committees like the Narasimhan Committee and a few other banking reforms committee was one way of using a subterfuge not to face that issue head-on. And Uday, I want to add and tickle your memory that at a particular point in Mr. Vajpayee's your as the Prime Minister, when he took the audacious step of wanting to reduce the equity of banks, there was huge opposition from the Congress party. And I do not mind sharing this, that I was asked by Mr. Vajpayee to go and persuade what he, in his characteristic Hindi, said to a person I had worked with earlier. I first didn't understand. Then I understood that he was meaning the former finance minister. And I went to him and I said this, in his characteristic humility, which is only essential, Dr. Manmohan Singh, put his head down and said, you know, MK, what my views are, but spare me this one. There is too much nostalgia on surrounding the nationalization, and there is too much hesitancy to move forward. But exactly for the reasons which you now mention, Uday, we have to orchestrate process which is embedded in consensus, orchestrate it in a manner which is multifaceted. So I'll leave that on the banking. On the core issues which has been raised, I entirely agree with Jayant and Arvind that there is no asymmetry between Atmanirbhar Bharat and a process in which we genuinely embrace, as we must embrace, trade as an engine of growth. I agree with Arvind that there are few countries in the world which are able to sustain an 8-9% rate of growth without using trade as not an impediment, but a powerful engine of growth in terms of not only the export income, in terms of employment, improving the overall total factor productivity of the economy, and of improving logistics in a significant way to sustained high growth exports would really imply. So there can be no disagreement. And I, for one, believe that now that with the change in the US administration, I see a revival of the multilateral process, particularly the World Trade Organization, hopefully will be rekindled with more life during the new presidency of the US. This alone, with the fact I agree, Arvind, that not to unduly lament on the RCEP, whatever it is, the fact remains that we must move on from that track into other arrangements, with, as you rightly pointed out, the Europe, if the US revives the Trans-Pacific Agreement, with other regional agreements, because the problem of geopolitics is that in the presentations which were made to me by the Revenue Secretary and the Finance Department, rules of origin are exceedingly opaque. And with some countries with whom we have a bilateral trading agreement with little or no value addition become a conduit for the same thing which you do not want to really. So I think on trade, I agree that this is a new opportunity to look ahead in the next 1 or 2 years on what can be done on important aspects of trade policy. I agree with you, Jayant, on some of the unfinished agenda. I agree that the banking and credit reforms is central. We cannot afford to have a high rate of economic growth without really dealing with this issue of banking. One issue on which, Jayant, I would love to have your views. And Tarun, if I may ask him, you permit as a moderator that the panelists can ask questions to themselves. So let me ask you, Jayant, a question, an issue that I have raised in my book on the section dealing with the reforms of parliamentary processes and parliamentary procedures. And since you had a very, very important committee, of which I was also a member during my period in Parliament, I was a member of the Standing Committee on Finance, apart from being in the Public Accounts Committee. Let me ask you, don't you think that the oversight of Parliament on the working of the executive can be significantly improved if the working of parliamentary standing committees need to be restructured? Specific point is, since you are heading this one of the most important committees, standing committees of Parliament, you know, my own experience, Jayant, that may be different now, is that the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance was burdened with excessive legislation work. too many legislations to be vetted, too many of them to be analyzed in detail. The number of times when one would sit back and say, is India's economic strategy right on the financial and banking sector? Are we moving in the right direction as far as the key economic reforms are concerned? The time and opportunity of the parliamentary standing committees available, in my view, needs to be broadened. Also, I think that as the chairman of the standing committee, it would be an important reform if the ministers of the concerned department really also find time to attend the standing committee's hearings. They are, after all, important hearings. Ministers only go to the consultative committee, in which they make, as Arvind Pangadia would know, a performa kind of a presence there. So the consultative committee is more or less non-functional. The standing committees are the more durable arm of parliament into disciplining the working of the executive. I stop here, Tarun.
No, I agree with you, sir. I think that the standing committees and, in fact, the consultative committees have a very important role to play. We just did a very useful discussion on 5G. I'm a member of the Telecom and IT Consultative Committee. We had a very good discussion with the Honorable Minister there. And I think all of us felt that that was a very rich interaction. And I think if we can bring some of that into the standing committees, I think it would be terrific from a policy-making perspective. To your earlier issue about the legislative agenda versus the policy agenda, because there are very important, serious policy issues that need to be discussed as well. I think we have to do both. And that really means that the committees have to meet once a week, which of course during the COVID pandemic has been very difficult. And my personal view would be that the more we can do virtually through videos and so on, also needs to be enhanced. We've not been doing that because of security reasons and so on, which are reasonable. But we've got to find a way to use technology to increase the number of sittings that we have, because many of these bills that come in and have to be examined, in fact, benefit a great deal from that kind of oversight and discussion that happens in detail in a parliamentary committee. For example, the Data Privacy Joint Parliamentary Committee has already made 89 amendments, I believe, to the bill that they got. So there's a tremendous amount of work that does happen in committee on these bills, and those are very valuable interventions as well. But equally, are these discussions on policy and what needs to happen. We've already done in the Finance Committee extensive work on both growth financing, venture capital and private equity, as well as on infrastructure financing. And we issued reports and had lots of follow-up discussions around that. So I think the policy matters also very valuable. Certainly, I think honorable ministers should be present for all of that. And I think that is very much required. I'll add something else to your list, which is the oversight of the important regulators. Now, as you know, in the Finance Committee, we actually have statutory, sort of oversight over the Reserve Bank of India, SEBI, Competition Commission of India, the Insolvency Board, PFRDA, IRDA. So all these important financial sector regulators as statutory bodies actually report to Parliament through the committee. And so we really need to spend a lot of time with these regulators to make sure that there is a sufficient accountability and the right policy framework there. And having been in the Ministry of Finance, I can tell you, because of just the very wide scope and the enormous number of issues you're dealing with, the ability to engage in detail with the regulators is often limited. So the committee, again, can play a very important role with regulators also. So I think committees need to meet much more often.
I entirely agree with you, Jen. Fortunately, I have written about exactly this issue in my book, that the parliamentary superintendence over the working of independent regulators certainly needs to be made more stringent. For instance, how many times does the governor of the Reserve Bank appear before the parliamentary standing committee? Look at the number of times that the governor of the Fed appears before the Senate and before the Congress. How many times is the SEBI chief, for instance, deposed before the standing committee? This weakens parliamentary supervision on the working of independent regulatory institutions. Since they are not accountable to government, they must be accountable in some ways to organs of parliament. Think about it.
You're quite right, sir. I agree with you.
NK, for that to happen, just as a bystander and looking from the outside, there will have to be a need for a cultural change. For the regulators to understand this system of appearing before standing committees of parliament. This must become part of the DNA and part of the practice of things. And obviously it is not there now. And but this is a very desirable thing to it's not been discussed enough. I think it's not been exposed enough. And of course the media never writes about it. So.
Yes, I know. The media never writes about it. In fact, Jayant, I wonder if you have ever faced this dilemma or whether or not to open up the meetings of standing committees to media scrutiny and media coverage. This is an unsettled debate. I couldn't make much progress in the Public Accounts Committee because there was a clamor, accepting on one or two issues. But I think this is also an issue to be pondered. Proceedings in the two houses are televised, but it is unknown what happens, and very important things happen in these standing committees. And they deserve, I entirely agree with Tarun, greater focus and attention.
Again, you're absolutely right, sir. And of course, if you look at parliamentary practice around the world, you'll find that they are televised. And in fact, committee meetings in the US are not just televised on C-SPAN, they are televised in the major networks as well, because so many of these are such important issues that, public attention is riveted on many of these hearings as well. So I do believe that there should be some flexibility for committees to be able to do it in camera and off camera as well, and be able to draw public attention to some of the discussions that can happen, both from witnesses as well as with regulators. So I think that's definitely something to be discussed. We have discussed it a few times, but there is no settled consensus on the matter.
I would think this has to be taken up at cabinet level and a decision taken, and then it flows downwards. Anyway, we will not go further down that road. I wanted to ask a question which is related to many of the things we have discussed, but we have not discussed this. The involvement of government in business and industry, through the public sector, and the exit or withdrawal of government from business and industry through, you call it disinvestment or privatization or whatever. Every year we hear about this, that there will be more disinvestment, government will withdraw from industry, targets are set. We always find targets are not achieved, and we are way behind the whole process. So what is the issue here? Why don't I start with you, Professor Panagria, because you have been in Niti Aayog, you would have addressed and thought about this issue. Will you give us a couple of points on this, and then I'll go to the other members of the panel.
Thanks, sir. Well, this is an issue I've been writing on quite extensively since leaving Niti Aayog as well. This process we actually started proactively in 2016 from Niti Aayog, and the PMO was very indulgent. They immediately agreed to our proposal to start evaluating the PSUs, public sector units or public sector enterprises that ought to be privatized. The cabinet was very responsive as well. So even in the first year in 2016, almost a dozen enterprises were actually cleared by the cabinet for privatization. And since then, that process has continued. So there are more than 3 dozen enterprises that have been cleared. I think where the problem is at the bureaucratic level. It is some sort of structural problem, which I do not understand, in the Department of Investment and Public Asset Management, DIPAM. We have secretary after secretary changed there, but not a single PSU has been privatized in 4 years since the process was actually begun. So I have actually now called for revisiting the issue of having a separate disinvestment ministry. I really think that this was used very effectively by Prime Minister Vajpayee. And we ought to perhaps have a separate ministry. And when the ministry will be actually evaluated on the basis of how many privatizations has it done, I think we'll get the action. In some of these cases, it's very puzzling because there's not a whole lot that DIPAM really has to do because PSUs are listed. Government stake in these are less than 60%. All you have to do is unload about 10 percentage point of shares in these listed enterprises. There is a market price, and you could even adopt a rule that every month we will, sell 2 percentage points of the shares. So there is no any sort of risk of the kind, the vigilance kind of risk, etc. At least in these. But even they have not happened. So I really think that we ought to go to a separate disinvestment ministry to make this happen, which I think is very important. I mean, this is something that needs to happen. Vibrancy ultimately, if you look at all the returns that are coming on public sector enterprises, abysmal. I mean, abysmal. Even forget the loss-making ones, but even the ones that are not loss-making, the returns are not even 1/3 of what you get on average on the listed enterprises in the private sector. So the nation is losing big time. And to the extent that we keep spending more and more of taxpayer money in restructuring, it is just very unfair. People think that somehow the government is paying for this. Government is not paying for it. The nation is paying for it. Taxpayers are paying for it. Government itself lives on the taxpayer ultimately. And so therefore it's just, good money being thrown after bad. So it is something which ought to be done and done on a large scale. Now, in fact, there is also need because of the fiscal being in a very tough spot right now. So there is every possible argument for doing it. And it's a matter of figuring out what the instrumentality is. Political will is certainly there, as reflected in the cabinet decisions.
Uday, how about taking on this task after ILFS?
No, I think it's
Uday be appointed the Minister of Disinvestment.
No, thank you very much. I just, on a more serious note, if I take the liberty, I think the issue is similar to what I call as driving the car looking at the rear view mirror rather than looking at the windshield in front. And what do I mean by this? The biggest concern of anybody implementing privatization, at least now we are more open to using the word privatization instead of disinvestment. I think that is progress in itself. I think is about, what if we sold it and after we sold it, the price went up? I think it is something which we have to be clear. As long as we have followed a fair and transparent process, we must get what is the best price possible at a point of time. We should not worry what happens 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years later. And we must look at the broader public interest that the process will create. There is too much of concern across various arms of the government. What if I sold and it is perceived to have been sold at too low a price? Or, the current price is so low, therefore how can I sell? I think we must make up our mind that this is the objective we want. We will follow a fair and transparent process and go ahead with vigor and rigor and not worry about what people will say or the public at large will say or vested interest politics will say later on against the process.
Mr. Sinha?
I've had considerable experience dealing with this set of issues, both at the Ministry of Finance and obviously the Ministry of Civil Aviation, where we dealt with the Air India disinvestments and, of course, the airport privatizations as well. And there are a real combination of things. A lot of them actually have to deal with some very complex procedural issues as well. And that takes time, and it requires actually fairly creative problem solving to be able to deal with the issues. I'll give you one example on Air India. as we had seen during the privatization of BSNL, that there are a number of non-core assets that you have to deal with when you deal with a PSU enterprise. So in Air India's case, there was a lot of real estate, there were a lot of subsidiaries like the maintenance and repair subsidiary that they have. And of course, they have an art collection, which was an extraordinary art collection. So there are a lot of non-core assets that are associated with many of these PSUs. And it takes a long time to sort through how to deal with some of these non-core assets. So one of the creative things we did for Air India was to actually, based on my sort of reading and understanding what had happened at VSNL, was to create a separate SPV and take all the non-core assets that were separate from the operational assets and put them into this SPV. So the land, the subsidiaries that were not part of the operating airline company, the art, all of that we segregated, separated, and removed those from the actual bidding for Air India. So that was one creative thing that we did to make Air India more attractive to bidders. And then, of course, we had to deal with the debt issue. So we moved some of the debt also over to the government, and we tried to clean up the operating asset and make it available for sale. So you have to do all of that. We had similar sets of issues when we dealt with the airports. There were liabilities, there were people issues. All of those took a long time to sort out and clarify. So those are procedural matters that you have to deal with. Then you have an issue of finding enough bidders. So of course, when we bid out Air India and we didn't get any bidders, it was a situation where the economic environment had suddenly weakened at that time. Oil prices had gone up. Airlines were not looking as attractive any longer. And even though we thought we had put forward a very attractive sort of proposition for bidders, no bidders landed up. And this is a very important issue that needs to be considered in privatization. Obviously, Professor Panagarya is right. There are some PSUs where you can just reduce their market, the market ownership of government and quote unquote, disinvest them that way. But in many other cases, you want to actually transfer management control to another entity. So you have to sell it in toto, you have to sell it completely. And in those cases, very often you don't have bidders. And it often takes a discovery and trial and error process to be able to figure out what are the terms under which people will eventually come. Even for airports, we had 2 failed bidding efforts, again, where we got very few bidders. And until we really changed the underlying regulations, we changed what we were offering, for how long we were offering, it's only then that we got very, very robust bidding in the 3rd round of bidding for airports. So there are a lot of procedural issues, but we also have a discovery process that's required to understand how can we make particular PSU assets attractive for private sector bidders. And with Air India, finally, we are getting there now because we are saying we are not bidding on the equity value, the highest equity value that anyone is bidding for with a certain debt level. But we are now bidding, and those of you who enjoy, kind of the finance side of it, as I'm sure Uday does, we are bidding it on enterprise value now there. So you can discover the level of debt that you would want to be able to take onto this asset as well. If you were going in there with a fixed level of debt and then trying to discover the equity value, maybe the equity value was such that that debt level could not be supported, which is of course what the market said. So now we've done it on enterprise value. These require changes, these require adjustments to the process, the bidding and everything else. So there are a number of procedural issues. Then there are, a lot of things you have to do to make it attractive to the bidders as well. So you have robust bidding. These are not easy things to resolve very, very quickly. It just takes time.
NK, any quick comments from you on this issue?
Well, I think that time will be winding up, isn't it?
Well, we've got a few questions from the audience, so shall I quickly move to that?
Tarun, you have 4 minutes left.
Yeah. So,
for 1 minute.
Professor Manoj Panda of IEG asked a question.
No, 1 minute, Tarun. You want to comment on this issue? Yes, I want to make a comment. I think that Uday has placed his hands exactly on the problem. I think that, Uday, you are right. Unless you have a degree of trust and you encourage people to act in panache, embedded and protected by ex post facto examination from multiple agencies, which is easier to wish away than they are in reality, particularly in parliamentary democracies, change of governments are something which normally happen and can happen. But the people who undertake these important responsibilities must have a protection as they look forward. And I would therefore think really that two laws need to be enacted. I agree with Arvind that perhaps a separate Ministry of Disinvestment would serve our cause better, because there are inherent conflicts of interest as long as it is with the Treasury. In fact, that the issue of governance reform is a wider issue which requires including the reform of the Ministry of Finance and the Reserve Bank of India, on which also have it. But you really require two laws. One, a law on bona fide action taken in the process of disinvestment, with all the processes and the benchmarks, some of which Arvind you have laid out. And second, equally, if you want public-private partnership to go forward, then I think that the legislative framework, which Dr. Vijay Kelkar had suggested precisely on this issue, needs to be given further and priority consideration for both disinvestment to take off. And I entirely agree with Arvind that given fiscal constraints, and Uday knows these fiscal constraints, there is no way but to push ahead with this agenda on privatization in a more aggressive way, but with those added protections. And I think that Jayan's brilliant intervention on the processes which need to be taken into account must be embedded in a kind of a legislative support. Equally, I think if you want public-private partnership, we need to have a framework which will encourage genuine public-private partnership to take place.
Now, as we are running out of time, there are several questions, but I'll take one which is specifically for the author. So, and not open it out to others. Your book brings to light a curious dichotomy. It indicates that you favor rules to discretion, as the former can offer support and signal commitment, but at the same time, it mentions that you were partial to non-corner solutions to allow for flexibility. Can you please explain this?
Yes, that is what good bureaucracy comprises of. That is what managerial skills are all about. That how do you achieve success within the rules and framework of the regulations? And that's how you achieve the goal, protecting yourself from subsequent consequences. Good management skills, which must be ingrained in the gene particles of every budding bureaucrat, needs to combine this. In the end, he is judged by only one dictum. Dent knows this for 2 generations. Can he deliver? Can he not deliver? Does he need to have cut corners, or can he find a way out within the existing rubric of rules and regulations? This is what success comprises of. You cannot give up panache. You cannot give up on discretion, but you need to exercise the discretion in a framework where accountability is also possible.
Professor Panagriham, this is why we always adored NK, because he got things done.
Absolutely.
He got things done. He implemented, he knew the how, not just what to do. He knew how to do it. And whether it is Mr. Bajpayee's telecom deregulation or Mr. Bajpayee's National Highway Authority, the Quad, which started the highway, he was there, he got it done. And that I think we need to clone him, in multiple ways to get things moving. One final question: how do we be competitive in a global economy if our input prices keep rising? And this is coming from Manoj Panda of IEG. So it's a vicious cycle, Professor Panagriham. How can India be competitive if the base keeps, the prices at the base, the costs keep rising, affecting all the downstream and upstream products?
Well, first of all, on cloning NK, if we could just have another 2 or 3 NKs, I think we would really raise the productivity of India by, or growth rate of India by 2 percentage points. So
Well said, well said.
I totally endorse that, because even one NK would push so many reforms within a reasonable time period that we would all be so much better off. So look, I mean, answer is very simple and clear, and I'm sure Manoj also knows this. We need to free up the input imports. Why are we levying tariffs? I mean, why should our input costs be any different? At least of the traded inputs. No, non-traded we can come to, but at least for the traded inputs, why should our costs be any more than those that Chinese producers have? There is no reason for it. So if our costs are different, then it is a self-inflicted wound. Now, the non-traded ones, of course, work needs to be done. I mean, clearly infrastructure, for instance. This is why also one of the big things we can do is I've advocated some sort of Shenzhen style autonomous zones. You take an area of 300-400 square kilometers, ideally 500 square kilometers, and declare that autonomous zone and empower that zone in the same way that Shenzhen local administrations are empowered. Shenzhen can make its own labor laws, and not to mention the land laws and all, and allow trade, the imports and exports to move very swiftly and rapidly. Locate at least 2 or 3 of those zones closer to the coast, so that, because internal infrastructure is taking us time. These are very large projects. Look at the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor. We've been building it for almost 10 years, and still it's some years, or certainly 7-8 years, and still some years away from being fully done. So if you're close to the coast, which is what China did, and all the other countries that were successful, like Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, they were coast, pretty much, coast was all around. But we are a much larger country, and if we look at some of these, Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Orissa, we got fantastic possibilities. Very good ports also exist. And really a few of those hubs can make all the difference. And particularly, I think, one point I have not mentioned yet is some focus, policy-oriented, policy-driven focus on labor-intensive industries. I think we are too obsessed with high-tech, with, we want to do the software, high-tech services and all, but they don't create good jobs for the people, for that large number of workers who don't have those kinds of skills. So there has to be a clear focus. I'd like to take, Park Chung-hee's approach of South Korea, the man who made South Korea what it is today. He used to hold every 2 months, he used to hold a meeting of all the stakeholders in the major export industries, including the entrepreneurs. And then he would push them, how much are you going to export in the next quarter? And if then next quarter they didn't meet their targets, he would ask them what failed. And he would then bring in his ministries, everybody that, if there are any bottlenecks of the government, he would clear them. Now, Prime Minister Modi actually does that on infrastructure extremely effectively. Every quarter we used to give reports to the Prime Minister on infrastructure from Niti Aayog. Very detailed, 3-hour meetings or so would happen. He would go into details and all, and that was very effective and has been very effective in moving infrastructure forward. I would do the same on exports. Do, some periodic meetings on exports. Our instinct always is to, when we want to monitor something, we want to monitor imports. Let the imports flow. You don't need to monitor imports. The more imports come, the more exports will go out. I mean, no country, you can look at any country's chart of imports and exports, they move together. Reduce imports, you will reduce exports. Let imports come in, exports will go out. In our own experience, I mentioned 2003 to 11 it testifies to that. So
Thank you.
I think that's where I would like to go.
Thank you very much. We've ranged over many issues. Closing comments, Mr. Sinha, then Uday, and I'll last word to NK.
Well, once again, a note of appreciation for everything Shri NKSingh Sahab has done over the years. It's been a tremendous honor and privilege to learn from him and to see, the kind of policy interventions that he has handled. We have all learned from the master, and I look forward to many more years of contribution from him. We need his eminence. We need his wisdom. And I think with the 15th Finance Commission, he's going to once again make a very, very major contribution to India's economic architecture.
Thank you. Uday?
Thank you, Tarun. First of all, thank you to Ananta and also, of course, NK Singh. NK in many ways has been a guru for me. When I started my career, I would be visiting the corridors of Delhi and calling on Mr. NK Singh in those days as a part of the dream team of the finance ministry. And it has been a great learning over the years about how government works. And NK brings with him a unique combination of understanding how government works with what the economy needs and how private sector thinks. So bringing these three things together is what I think is really what India needs today. How do we get this combination of the government, the needs of the economy, as also the needs of business and industry together to build a competitive and a sustained India of growth? And like him, I share the optimism on India's future.
Thank you. Mr. Author?
Well, nothing left for me to say except to thank all the panelists who have been so exceedingly generous in talking about the book and talking about some of the areas in which my policy engagement is reflected in this book. I thank each one of them individually. I like to thank Uday, with whom, as I said, I have dealt with from very, very early period when he was beginning to become a great entrepreneur, which he is now providing great leadership to CII. I think that Uday, you can make a bold change in the ethos of the CII. I've pinned a lot of hopes on you. To Arvind, whose writings have and thoughts have influenced many aspects of Indian policy making. We miss Arvind greatly. Since he's now really in Colombia, I really miss him very much for the period which we spent in the Niti Aayog, and we interacted very closely. To Jayant, I think that since all that I can say is that I have great hopes in you. You have a huge future ahead to make an lasting contribution to the Indian economy and to sustain the rich legacy and the traditions which Jayant you inherit. So Tarun, to you, the supreme moderator who knows it all, the master needs no guidance on how to conduct an event purposefully. And to Kiran, of course, who remains silent, but it's Kiran's organizational skills, which she knows I have greatly admired and about which I have written extensively in the book. When Kiran takes on an event, Kiran has mastered and micromanaged the full detail. All I can say, I'm profoundly grateful, all of you, for the privilege and honor you have done to me for sparing this time to participate in this book event today, arranged kindly by the Ananta Aspen Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, NK. Thank you to all our panel members. All of you are wonderful people, great people, and I share NK's views on wishing you all the very best. And I hope 2021 is a very good, a very happy, very successful year for all of you. And that includes you, NK. Thank you very much. The webinar is over.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, NK.
Thank you, Tarun.